Okay, so chapter 12 is just the central nervous system. And we're going to go, I say just the central nervous system, but we're going to go over brain and spinal cord. We're going to do general anatomy, and then we're going to talk about the function of each part. Things to keep in mind. Sensory is always going to be anterior ventral. Motor is always going to be anterior ventral. Sensory is always going to be posterior or dorsal. Okay? You're going to see that in the spinal cord and in the brain. Sensory is going to be blue. Motor is going to be red. You're going to see those patterns as well. Okay? And we'll talk about other patterns as we go through, but there's going to be a lot of redundancy here as well. You have very specific jobs for this part, and as you move down, less thought is needed, so there's more redundancy in work. Okay? So very specialized to very general. And you're going to see that pattern as we go through. So the first term is cephalization. All cephalization means in a biological concept is that there's a group of nerve tissue at the anterior portion of that organism. So you and I have a group of nerve tissue at the anterior portion of us, and it's our brain. So that's what cephalization is. So you and I are considered cephalized. Any organism that has a brain or a group of ganglia is considered cephalized. You and I just happen to be the most complex cephalized animal. So here it talks about the division of the brain from beginning to end as far as development is concerned. So I'm going to go to the diagram to show you this. But here is what your nervous tissue, your central nervous system looked at initially when you were first starting to develop your brain and spinal cord. So here you are, just a little pole. And then it started to kind of bulge to take forms. And then additional differentiation took place. So this diagram here tells you from this point, all this right here becomes all of this in your adult brain. This right here becomes this. This right here divides up and becomes those. This diagram is actually pretty informative. It also mentions here which ventricle it's associated with. The other place in the body you'll hear the term ventricle is the heart. These ventricles are referencing where the fluid is in the brain. So that cerebral spinal fluid we referenced in the previous chapter, this is where it's held in what we call our ventricles. Okay, so it's telling you that this fourth ventricle here takes care of serving this area. This cerebral aqueduct takes care of the midbrain, which is still part of the brain stem here. Then the third ventricle, the diencephalon, and so on. So you can see the association. Now, I'm going to show you what the ventricles are in a little bit, but I wanted to put that there so that you can see all that information that's there. As far as how your brain grows, your brain grows faster than your skull, so your brain has to fold. The more folds you have in your brain, the more information it holds. So your intelligence isn't measured by the size of your brain, but the folding of your brain. And because you have a limitless capacity to acquire knowledge, it will continue to fold. So it mentions that here. Now this is talking about an embryonic folding pattern. So this is how you kind of started off. This was your first. After that too, here's your brain. Then it kind of folds back. Okay, so you have your spinal cord. Here is what we're going to end up calling our brain stem. So you have your midbrain, your pons, your medulla oblongata. This is your diencephalon, and then here is going to be this part of your brain. And then it continues to develop until it becomes specialized. So here we are now as grown adults. These are the four divisions of our brain. Cerebral hemispheres, that's this and this. Cerebrum. Not to be confused with the cerebellum, which is at the back, posterior and bottom. Brainstem has three parts, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And the diencephalon is the very top that has the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. And we'll discuss all of that. But this is the general intro slide to that. Okay? So here we have our spinal cord, our medulla oblongata, our pons, midbrain, diencephalon. Right here is your pituitary gland. Here is your cerebrum, cerebellum. the spinal cord, and here's another pattern that you're going to see. This brain, your brain is white matter in the middle, gray matter on the outside. Your spinal cord is white matter on the outside, gray matter on the inside. That's a pattern that you're going to see that's pretty consistent. So again, the brain is gray on the outside, white in the middle, and the spinal cord is white on the outside, gray in the middle. Okay, and so it mentions that the external is white. And it uses the term tract. What am I talking about? Tract. Central nervous system. It's a bunch of axons together in the central nervous system. That's a tract. The brain, again, has a similar pattern, but we have the gray matter on the outside, the white matter on the inside. I believe this is the second time we've heard the term cortex. But cortex is a term that's used on a lot of organs, a lot of structures. But the cortex is the outer few millimeters of that structure. So when you hear the cerebral cortex, that's the outer few millimeters of your cerebrum. Your cerebral cortex is gray matter. Okay? The cortex is the outer few millimeters. So the cerebral cortex is gray matter. Oh, this is talking about the ventricles. Remember, blood can't touch your brain. Do you remember what cells line to create that barrier? I know this is going to shock you, but the answer's up there. Oh. An awkward moment when it's the ependymal cells. Yeah, the ependymals. It's actually the first folded. But whatever, it's fine. It's Tuesday and you took a really hard test. Okay, so I get it. But the ependymal cells create that blood-brain barrier, and instead of blood getting close, we have that CSF, which is your cerebral spinal fluid. Okay, and the ependymal cells help to distinguish between the blood and the CSF. All right, and that area where we find the cerebral spinal fluid is what we reference as the ventricles. So, there's actually a really cool model, but these are what your ventricles look like. Here's an anterior view, here's a lateral view. They sit right inside your brain and make sure that there's plenty of oxygen, glucose, and whatever electrolytes you need to serve your central nervous system, your brain. And you can see that it continues down here. So the ventricles are responsible for housing and even actually creating the cerebral spinal fluid. You create cerebral spinal fluid continuously. Every 8 hours you wash it out. That's why if you take drugs or anything like that, you have an epidural, it wears off. Because your cerebral spinal fluid is recreated and the old one is recycled, so the medicine is gone. Okay? When we talk about the cerebral hemispheres, you have your left and right hemisphere. Okay? There are two fissures, and a fissure is the term for something like a deep, deep groove. So we have the longitudinal fissure, which divides us into left and right halves. And then we have the transverse one, which is what separates your cerebrum from your cerebellum. It also gives you the term gyri and sulci. Those are terms referenced for the folds in your brain. Okay, so the gyri are like the little, what you can run your fingers across, and the sulci are the shallow grooves. A fissure is a deep groove. There are 5 lobes in your cerebrum. I bet you can tell me where 4 of these 5 are. Where's the occipital lobe? The frontal lobe. Parietal. Temporal. Okay? The insula is in the middle. So you actually have to pull a rake. A rake is technically a folded fork. When you get, if some of you are going to be like surgical technicians, but like rake, it's a fork that's been folded. Let me show you what I'm talking about. Oh, wait, there's no rake there. Okay, but there's a rake in one of these pictures. I'll show you. Cerebral hemispheres, the cerebral cortex. What is the cortex again? Outer few millimeters. Outer few millimeters, we already told you that is gray matter. Okay, the white matter is inside. Then you have the term basal nuclei. What does basal tell you? It's the bottom layer. And the nuclei just means it's a nucleus. This is plural. You actually have a whole lot of basal nuclei And I'll point those out as we get there. You don't have to know them, but that's what that's referencing. Okay? So here would be my gyri, just these superficial little lumps. Then sulci are these, this one would be deeper because it's clearly labeled a fissure. But here's a shallow one, a sulci. Fissures are much deeper. So using those terms that were on the previous slides. Here is the cortex. That's gray matter versus the white matter of the brain. It has it divided into its lobes there. Why do you think... Let me get there. Let me get to the teaching part of it first, and then I'll discuss it before I go to colors again. Okay. Here are my rakes. Fancy little rakes. They're folded forks, and they're pulling back so that you can see the inside. This is the insula, the inside of that brain. So you have your cerebrum, cerebellum, insula right there, and you can see the various lobes there. Okay. This brain is a great representation. This is showing you with no vessels. This is showing you with vessels. And your brain is technically wrapped in saran wrap. There's 3 layers of it because these vessels can't touch your brain. So that's why it has that kind of glossy look to it, because there's actually tissue there that's separating this vessel from that neural tissue. So those vessels are not just lying right there on that tissue. They're separated by what we'll end up calling the pia mater. And we'll do that today. Good looking brain. Okay, the cerebral cortex, I already told you it's the outer few millimeters. This is the site of conscious mind, awareness, sensory perception. It goes on and it tells you what that's responsible for. Anything that you do that you are aware of consciously involves your cerebral cortex. Let's talk about the terms perception versus sensation real quick, because you're going to see those terms back and forth and people think that they're the same. Sensation means that you feel it. You don't necessarily respond to it. You feel it, you don't respond to it. There's a lot of things that you sense throughout the day that you don't pay attention to. In fact, your brain filters them out. I'll give you an example here in a moment. Perception means you sense it and you respond to it. Okay? If you're perceiving something, you're responding to it. So let me give you an example. In the hallway, when I walk in the high school, there's a lot of talking going on. And so I pretty much block it out. I sense it, but I'm not responding to it. But then I hear somebody say, Miss G, Miss G. And I recognize the voice. And it's somebody who annoys me. I'm making a conscious decision to not acknowledge them and pretend like I don't hear them. So the difference between sensation and perception. Perception means I'm thinking about it. Like, I hear him. And I'm like, keep walking. Like, I'm making that. That's perception. Sensation is when you're sensing it, but you're not responding to it. An example of that, my husband hates being in the car when the kids are arguing. It doesn't bother me one bit, because I don't even listen. Like, they could be hitting each other, somebody bleeding, and I'm like, and he'll flip out if he's in the car. He's like, what are y'all doing? Does that not drive you nuts? I'm like, what are you talking about? I know what's going on. I zone it out. Sensation versus perception. So you're going to see those terms over and over again. Perception means you're consciously reacting to it. Perception means that. Did I say that? Perception means that? Okay, good. I thought I heard myself say sensation. Okay. When you're talking about your cerebral cortex, so there's motor areas. Guess what those are responsible for? Movement. There are sensory areas. Okay, receiving information. Association areas are getting us in between the two. Okay? Your brain controls contralateral. Your hemispheres are contralateral in their control, meaning your right side controls your left side controls your right side. Contralateral is what that means there. Okay? It mentions that there's lateralization of the cortical function. What that means is there are certain things that the left side of your brain does, and there are certain things that the right side of your brain does. They both don't do the same thing. Okay, like you've heard people say, oh, you're more left brain or you're more right brain. That's what that's referencing. Okay, so they control contralaterally, but there's more left brainedness. I don't even care. I don't care. Okay, if you're conscious of what you're doing, your cortex is involved. that gray matter is involved if you're consciously responding to it. The cortex is involved in some way, shape, or form, and we'll get to that. So here we have just a dyed brain where you can see the different lobes there. This is using an MRI, and a functional MRI tells us that this is the part that's actually reacting. Anything that's colored, well, not really that, but tells us that there's activity going on there. All right, motor areas of the cerebral cortex. So we're in the cerebral cortex. Where is that? Outer few millimeters. The motor area, what part of the brain? It's going to be the front. Why is motor going to be the front? Motor is anterior or ventral. You're going to see that pattern. What color is going to be associated with it? Red-ish-ness. Okay, you're going to see different versions of that. So as we go through these areas right here, where it says motor areas of the cerebral cortex, premotor cortex, Broca's area, frontal eye field, these are all controlling actions, physical movement. So is that afferent or efferent? Efferent. It's traveling down. You're just connecting dots now. It's not we're learning new stuff, we're just connecting dots. We're just dissecting these terms and connecting them. So here, we have the central sulcus. So this is kind of this mapping point that we use for reference. Motor, sensory. Motor, sensory. So you can see here, primary motor cortex. Primary somatosensory cortex. So red, blue. This is mostly sensory. Motor, prefrontal cortex, we're going to talk about the difference there on that. That's where you consciously consider what's good and bad and all of that. And we're going to discuss that in just a moment. Primary motor cortex. Whenever we talk about the primary motor cortex, big picture, we have tracts. Tracts is a term that's used when I'm referencing the central nervous system. It's just a group of axons. This allows for conscious control, precise, skilled movement, skeletal muscle movements. We have a motor homunculi. A motor homunculi is nothing more than a diagram, and I'm on the red side here. It's showing you which part of your cerebral cortex controls the movement of those various areas. Here it's in blue, so what is this? This is the sensory. Okay, so this is like a caricature that kind of shows you where the control of those are. This shows you where you get all the sensation from. This is where you do all the controlling the movements. When you're looking at your brain up there, the red is motor, the blue is sensory. The red is anterior, the blue is dorsal, or posterior. It would be the opposite of anterior. I'll get my life straight. Not today, though. Okay, so premotor cortex. Premotor tells you what? Before I actually move. So this is me kind of thinking through what it is that I'm going to do. So it helps plan the movements, stage them. Sometimes when you look at something, like if there's a whole lot of stairs that you have to scale, sometimes you think to yourself, is there an elevator? Or that's premotor, before you actually scale those stairs. Okay, you plan out what that movement would look like. If you're doing something for the first time, you kind of plan out how you would do that. That's premotor, okay? So it mentions that as far as its the aspects that it is in charge of, or it controls, and gives you some further explanation. The Broca's area, Broca's and Wernicke's. Broca's area is how you physically move your mouth to create speech. So this is control of your mouth muscles, your tongue, that allows you to speak. A lot of times this is associated with strokes. People will ask, where was the stroke? If the stroke was in the Broca's area, they can still think about what they want to say, but they can't physically say it. So a lot of times they'll write it out. If the stroke was a Wernicke's, that's where they can't think about what they were trying to say, but they can still speak. So they say things that are random, and people are like, what? Trying to figure out what's going on. And sometimes whenever you walk up to a patient, they are saying things that don't make sense. You're like, they could possibly have had a stroke. And it just affected that part of their brain that controls what they say. Okay? So the Broca's area is the actual movement motor movement of the muscles, so you know what to, or how to say and make those sounds. What do you think the frontal eye field does? Frontal eye field. It should, yeah, it says it up there, but it tells your eye to move. I like this slide. Anyways, so we reference these areas right here. Okay, and then it kind of shows you another view. You can see the color coded, and that's why I kind of said reddish colorness, because there's kind of some pinkish to it as well. And then you have your blue is, whatever. I don't even care anymore. All right. Now we're in the sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So where am I right now? We're back here. Okay? It's divided up into a couple of areas, but then there's association areas. And so you're going to see a pattern here as well. And I'm going to need some common sense on some of these. Like a visual area, guess what we're going to sense here? Yeah, what you see. Okay? In the auditory areas? Yes. Yeah, see where I'm at right now? What about gustation? Taste. This is you tasting. Visceral sensory. What's your organs? What you're feeling here? Okay? Vestibular is balance. Vestibular is balance. It used to be that your balance and auditory was the same, and now we've separated them. So you have balance and audition separate. Proprioceptors. I mentioned this before as well. I think this was like the second lecture we had. But proprioceptors are sensory receptors that are located in your skeletal muscle that send messages to your brain continuously. There's no real stop. That tells your brain, hey, your right hand's over here. Or, hey, you're holding a marker here. Okay, proprioceptors tell you where your limbs are. So these are sensory receptors. If I put my hand behind my back, and I think this was the example I used, and I put 3 fingers up, I know that there's 3 fingers up. I'm not like, how many fingers am I holding up? Like, I know because I can feel what's happening. If I put my hand in the garbage disposal, which you shouldn't do, but I still know what my hand is doing even though I can't physically see it. Does that make sense? So, like, that's what proprioception is, where you receive the information about where everything is located, and this is a continuous amount of information. A somatosensory homunculus. Somato tells you what? Voluntary. Voluntary sensory, and then the diagram that shows you. So this is just, without the motor that was there previously, this is just sensory. Again, it's blue. It's posterior. All right, somatosensory association. So you're going to see visual areas, and then it's going to be followed up by visual association. Here is where your thinking cap gets on, because when you look at something, you're receiving that information, then the visual association area has to take over and tell you whether you've seen it before or not. When you look at somebody and you're like, I recognize them, your visual association area is the one that triggered that. You've seen that before. And so then what do you start doing? Where do I know him from? Like, you try to start connecting dots. Your visual association area tells you if you've seen that before. If you haven't seen it before, it immediately starts to create a new memory. Then we have the auditory area and then auditory association. What do you think auditory association is? Have I heard this before? Have I heard this before? And if I've heard it before, then I know what that is. Like, I know what it sounds like when my phone rings, but if there's something random that goes on and I don't know that sound, immediately I start to create a memory. Does that make sense? So that's what you're going to see here. You're going to see the sensory area, and then you're going to see an association. Your brain is trying to figure out, have you experienced this before? And if you haven't, then we need to create a new memory so that you remember it in the future. When you talk about associations, depending on whatever it is that we're talking about, you're talking about the size, the texture. You're trying to create memories so that you can associate everything that you expose yourself to. Okay, and of course I want you to be lifelong learners, but nonetheless. Visual cortex is just allowing you to be able to see something. So you receive visual information from the retinas. So I look at it, I'm like, oh, that's a wall. Well, I don't know that's a wall, but that's what I see. My visual association area tells me, I've seen that before, and that looks like a wall. Okay, that's what that is. Same thing when I talked about your ability to recognize faces, street signs. You're looking at different vehicles. You recognize vehicles, or I haven't seen that vehicle before. Those are all part of memories that you've created. Some of you tend to notice things more than others. I tend to notice nothing. Nothing. Unless it's like right in front of my face. And some of you may notice everything. Okay? So it just depends. That's a personality thing as well. But when we talk about association. Now, auditory cortex. The auditory cortex is if I've heard it before, or if it's just me hearing it. The association is whether or not I've heard it before. If I haven't heard it before, then I create a memory. So you have the stimulus, and then whether you've heard it before or not is association. Vestibular is balance. The vestibular cortex is just responsible for your balance. We use our proprioceptors to take care of this as well. So we're constantly receiving information to say our left arm's over here, our right arm's over here. And if I shift my weight, my brain knows that so that I can maintain my balance. Okay? This is also signaled through fluid in our ears, which is covered in 2402. There's no association area for vestibular. Olfactory cortex is smelling. Yes, so you're smelling it. Conscious awareness of odors. Gustatory cortex is, gustation is taste. Yes, taste. Visceral sensory, we already mentioned this before, but this is your organs. Receiving information from your organs, like your stomach hurts, you have to pee. So sensory is back here, motor up here. Same diagrams. Okay, multimodal association. Multimodal. I'm using a lot of different things and bringing them all together. This is what our textbook and every textbook is going to tell you. This is what makes you unique to you. It makes us all just a little bit different. Your facial expressions, the way you respond to different visual stimuli, auditory, gustatory, olfactory stimuli, that's what makes you unique. And each of us responds just a little bit different. So it mentions the sensations, thoughts, emotions become conscious, and that makes us who we are. So some of you see certain things and you don't respond to it. That's just you. Some of us may see that exact same thing that you don't respond to and get excited. So that just is unique to us. So multimodal association is you bringing everything together. You just doing you, being you. Okay. When we talk about these areas right here, we'll talk about anterior association, posterior, and limbic. I know you know anterior and posterior, but does anybody know what limbic means? Limbic is your emotions. Your limbic system is one of my favorite systems. This is what causes you to make the faces that you make, to get excited or to get upset. Your limbic system also allows you to create memories faster than anything else. When I told you a moment ago, you tend to remember things when you're excited. Because when you're happy emotionally, memories are freely flowing. You tend to, and some of you are more, you like sad things more so. But if you focus on positive things, it's easier to remember whenever you're happy. If you focus on sad things, you just remember bad things or sad things. Okay, but your limbic system is your emotional. You and I, humans, have a very advanced limbic system. Dolphins do as well. We put emotion to pretty much everything. Okay, so we can tie emotion to most of what we do. Anterior association area. This is talking about your prefrontal cortex. So notice that it doesn't say motor, anything there. It just says prefrontal. So I have my frontal cortex. This is prefrontal. This is right here. This is the part of the brain that I don't know how old all of you are, but I know when I was younger they were experimenting on prisoners to see, and rapists, because they found that people who did heinous crimes like that didn't have the conscious feedback from society. They didn't know what they were doing was wrong, and they felt no remorse for it. So they believe that there's a disconnect between how society is going to respond to it, their conscious awareness of what they were doing, whether it was right or wrong. They felt like there was a disconnect. So there was literally surgeries done on inmates on death row for these heinous crimes to see if they could rehabilitate them by taking out part of their prefrontal cortex. And of course they all died. And then they stopped doing it because they realized when you remove part, you're taking the part of the brain. That was an issue. Okay? And of course that's considered inhumane now, right? But the thought process was, if they don't feel remorse, or that's this part of the brain, so what if we tried to change that? Could we rehabilitate these people? And that's what it references. So your prefrontal cortex, the development of this is dependent upon how your what feedback you receive from your social interactions. For example, if you have small children, when you tell them no, at first they get upset, and if you get upset back, they remember that. And then the next time they try to do it, you tell them no, they remember what they got feedback. They know what no means. Now, if you tell that child no, and then they do it anyway, and there's no consequence, what does no mean to that child? Yes. Okay, so the prefrontal cortex, what's right and wrong, that is developed based on how society responds to what you do. The people around you, how that develops, they help develop that area of your brain. Okay? Posterior association area, it specifically references the Wernicke's area. The Wernicke's area is that part of the brain I told you that was responsible for figuring out the sensation of written or spoken language. So you can think, and the speaking part comes from anterior because that's motor. So it helps you, the posterior association plays a role in recognizing things, and that's because all of that is sensory. So recognizing a smell, recognizing a taste, recognizing a sight or a vision, or something like that. Posterior association. Now limbic. Limbic brings emotion to it. So anytime limbic is brought in, there's emotion to some degree. When you can tie emotion to anything, it solidifies a memory. And we're even going to talk about short-term versus long-term memory in this unit as well, or chapter as well. So if you can put an emotional impact, you can establish a strong memory. So you will either remember this class and hate it because it stressed you out, or you'll remember this class and you like it. I'm going to go with the former, but whatever. Okay, it is what it is, and we're adults. Lateralization of cortical function. This is what say that the left side of your brain tends to cover or be responsible for logic, mathematical processing, methodical reasoning, any of that. The right side tends to be more creative, abstract. So if you're a more logical person, you tend to be right-handed. If you're more abstract and artsy, you tend to be left-handed. Okay? The majority of our population is left brain dominant. So it mentions, I don't know that it mentions that, but that is the thing. It does mention what the left and right hemispheres generally control. Okay? Cerebral white matter. So if it's cerebral, where am I at? Up here. And if I'm white matter, where am I up here? Towards the middle. Okay? So the cortex is the gray matter on the outside. The cerebral white matter can be divided up into association, commissural, and projection fibers. This is just an anatomical reference. Okay, just anatomical reference, and I don't even believe it's on your test, but it may be if it's on your review. Here you can see they're color-coded. Okay? So you have your association fibers, your projection fibers in purple, and then your commissural fibers here in green. So here's that view. Here's the side view. Association. Look what the not that if we had a lot of time I would totally dissect this, but the association uses a lot of the cortex. This is me trying to figure out where I've been, how have I realized, why do I recognize that? Why is this all familiar? This is me coming back to my reticular activating, which you and I are going to talk about here in just a bit. But so that's talking about the white matter of the cerebrum. The basal nuclei. We already talked about basal meaning bottom, and nuclei is the nucleus. You have a lot of these, and they're not named something fancy. They're named based on where they are located. So it'll say like posterior nuclei. Guess where that is? In the back, right? Okay, and then it'll say like superior lateral nuclei. It's up and to the side. Okay. Filter out incorrect and inappropriate responses. That's truly based on society feedback, because some of you don't have this ability still yet. Okay? And I didn't mean that sounded rude. Anyway, and then that inhibits antagonistic or unnecessary movements, meaning it tries to smooth out what you're doing, and that's going to coordinate with your cerebellum. So there's no need for jerking and moving, like it tries to coordinate and make your movements smooth. And we'll discuss that too as we get through to the cerebellum in just a moment. The diencephalon, which is where the nuclei are located, so I'm going to get to a diagram of the nuclei in just a moment, is divided into three parts. The thalamus, the anterior portion of that is called the hypothalamus, and the posterior portion is called the epithalamus. So here's where I'm at right now. So initially we talked about the cortex and all those areas and motor and sensory and so on. And then we talked about just the white matter, and that was the association, the commissural, and the projection fibers. That's all we said on that. And now we're here. So we're moving from outside in. That's the way this chapter is designed and how it's laid out. This right here, all in purple, is what we call the diencephalon. Here is my thalamus. Here's my hypothalamus. This is the anterior region of it. Here's my epithalamus. It's the posterior region of it. Okay, as far as the anatomy of the thalamus, you have two bulbs, and they're connected by an interthalamic adhesion. So that just means the spot between them where they're stuck together. You don't have to know that, but that's what that is. Each of these right here is a nuclei. And this, I like this slide because it has them labeled, and you can kind of see how their names are associated with their location. You don't have to know each of the nuclei. You don't have to know what they do. But this is that purple structure there. So we call this the diencephalon. This is specifically the thalamus, the area of the thalamus. And so there's two lobes, or two small hemispheres to that. And we call it nuclei because you have a lot of basal nuclei. But that's why that term is what it is. What does the thalamus do? That's what this slide says. The thalamus is a relay. Sensory information goes up, it hits the thalamus, and the thalamus sends it to the part of the cerebrum that it needs to go to. So this is what this is what needs to happen. Okay, so it mentions that it's a gateway to the cerebral cortex. It sorts, edits, and relays ascending input. But that's not the only thing that it does. It gives you some examples of what type of input it may send up, but it mediates sensation, motor activities, cortical arousal. You're going to see this over and over again. Cortical arousal means the arousal of the cortex. Okay, so that you perceiving things. Learning and memory. We've already said learning and memory before. Okay, so this is like I'm saying, this stuff is going to become redundant. You get really specific out here, and it's just going to be repeat, repeat, repeat as we continue to descend the central nervous system. The hypothalamus is the part that is anterior. It has a little stalk that's called an infundibulum that attaches the pituitary gland. If you're with me for, even on Thursday we'll talk a little bit more about the hypothalamus. But here is the hypothalamus. We have more nuclei here. This is the infundibulum, so just a little stalk that attaches the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is a really important gland in our endocrine system. What does the hypothalamus do? The next couple slides, because the hypothalamus has multiple functions. But most people reference the hypothalamus for body temperature regulation, thirst centers, hunger centers. So that's the type of thing that you hear when you hear hypothalamus. Physical responses to emotions. That's part of the limbic system, which surrounds a hypothalamus. So we're going to look at that in just a moment. Limbic, again, is emotion, perception of pleasure, fear, rage, and in biological rhythms and drives. That's your sexual drives and your circadian rhythms. Continuing on hypothalamic function. Regulates body temperature, regulates hunger, regulates water balance, regulates sleep and wake cycles. Controls the endocrine system. The hypothalamus does a lot. You can't just say, oh, well, this is what's in charge of. It does a lot of things, which is why it's on multiple slides. The epithalamus is the posterior part. Posterior part is much simpler. It just has the pineal gland. The pineal gland releases melatonin. Melatonin regulates your circadian rhythm, your sleep cycles. You can be in a sleep pattern for 21 days, and if you can maintain a sleep pattern for 21 days, regardless if you have that stimulus or not, you'll wake up at that same time that you put yourself on. But you have to do it. 21 days is the biological time frame for that. So the first week is usually the roughest. Second week is not so bad, but by the third week, you're able to get into it. By fourth week, it's part of your schedule. This is why when summer starts, a lot of kids wake up early, and then as summer goes on, they start to sleep later and later. Then it's right before school starts, and they're sleeping until 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And then they have to wake up, the next morning, whatever, at 6 a.m., and they're like, no, and they're dragging, and they hate it. But that's because of that gland regulating their sleep and wake cycles. So, structure here, again, thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus. All of this collectively is the diencephalon. You look in brain. All right, brainstems. So we're moving our way down. 3 parts to the brainstem: midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata, and that's in descending order. So midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Ultimately, the brainstem is responsible for our survival behaviors. So you're going to see cardiovascular centers, you're going to see respiratory centers, okay? You're going to see non-respiratory movements like vomiting, coughing, hiccuping, all of that is brainstem, okay? So your reflexes, this is pretty much autonomically controlled, meaning you really don't control, like vomiting. Some of you can control your vomiting and that can be stimulated. But some of you, like something happens, like you smell a smell, and for whatever reason it stimulates you to vomit. Like that's not you telling yourself to vomit, that's your reaction or that's your reflex to that. Okay, hiccups, I'm sure people can intentionally give themselves hiccups, but a lot of times hiccups are just a response to the phrenic nerve being irritated. So that's not anything that you really control. And those are non-respiratory movements. Here, it would go midbrain, up in this area just above that. This is the pons. Here's the medulla oblongata. So here is a good view so you can see both lobes of the thalamus. So collectively the diencephalon, midbrain, pons, medulla oblongata. Same thing. Okay, the pons. What the pons is responsible for: maintains a normal rhythm of breathing. And it helps with reticular formation. We're going to talk about reticular formation in just a moment. But reticular formation and the normal rhythm of breathing. Normal rhythm of breathing. Yes, reticular formation. Reticular formation. We're going to talk about that in just a moment for RAS. Okay, medulla oblongata is your cardiovascular center. So it has your cardiac center and your vasomotor center. So we know what motor is. What about vaso? What are we talking about? Anybody know? Your blood vessels. Yes. It could be arteries or veins. It just, when you say vaso, generally speaking, it could be both. When you say veno, we know it's veins. So we'll talk about that also more in O2 when we get into the circulatory system. But cardiac and vasomotor, so it's controlling your heart rate and the diameter of your blood vessels. It's either constricting them or dilating them depending on how much blood flow you need. The medulla oblongata also has your respiratory system centers. So we saw that in the pons, and it's also in the medulla oblongata, so that's an overlapping function. The respiratory center is responsible for regulating your respiratory rhythm. Additional non-respiratory movements: vomiting, hiccuping, swallowing, coughing, sneezing. These are all controlled by your medulla oblongata. The cerebellum. The cerebellum is the part at the most posterior end underneath here. When you look at the cerebellum, I'm going to go to this picture real quick. To me, this looks like ground beef, like raw ground beef. Here is white matter. And in fact, we call that white matter the arbor vitae, which is the tree of life. It kind of has a tree type shape to it. Your cerebellum, I'm going to go back, allows for smooth, coordinated movements. Okay? For example, as you learn to walk, you stutter and then it becomes smooth. Your cerebellum takes over there. That's all motor, and those are repetitive movements. The ability to ride a bike after you've learned one time and then 20 years later you can still ride a bike, that's your cerebellum. It remembers that. If you have damage to your cerebellum, like you get hit really hard here, it impairs your balance. it stops that and your coordination of those movements, so you start to stutter and even fall. And whenever you are drinking alcohol, your cerebellum is supposed to help you have coordinated, smooth movements, but alcohol inhibits that. So even though you think you look really smooth walking, maybe you don't, maybe you do. I don't know. I haven't seen you. Hopefully I won't. Okay? Arbor vitae is that tree-like pattern, that white matter. Cerebellum. Good picture. Cerebellum colored here, so you can see that arbor vitae there. So real quick, you'll hear cerebral and cerebellar. Make sure you keep them separate. Cerebral is here, cerebellar is down here. Okay? This talks about, yes, the cerebellum. So it gives your body the information on where it is, where everything is at. It calculates the best way for you to move your muscles or coordinate those movements. Overall, it's the blueprint of what a coordinated movement should look like. It sends that to your brain or to your muscles so that you carry out that movement depending on what direction it's going. Okay? Functional brain systems. Any question on what we've talked about so far? Keep rolling. Reticular activating and limbic. Reticular activating system is what kind of keeps you alive. Limbic, I already told you, is emotion. Okay? Where this right here is kind of showing you the limbic system. The key parts here in the limbic system are going to be the amygdaloid body, the cingulate gyrus, and the hippocampus. So it is the interaction of those three specifically that cause you to make the facial expressions that you make. When you can remember crazy amounts of information, it saves and it actually enlarges your hippocampus. Real quick question. What professional has the largest hippocampus? Yes, taxi drivers have the largest hippocampus because they have to be able to recall different directions, paths, and ways to access different establishments. So if you get up at the airport and say, I need to get to that Chinese restaurant with the red roof, he has to know or she has to know where that is and how to get there, and the fastest and quickest way to do so. People tend to think that it's doctors, but why is it not doctors or lawyers? Because they're really smart, but they do store it. Here's the difference, and this is a thing, life lesson real quick. Doctors are really smart at one thing, whatever it is that they specialize in. Does that make sense? And I hate, I'm saying that not in a disrespectful way, but you don't go to a neurologist and ask them for help resetting a bone. Although they may be able to do that because anybody could technically reset a bone if they had enough common sense and logic. They don't have the scientific knowledge necessary to carry out what they're supposed to in the way that they're supposed to. So they're really good at one thing. That's why a lot of doctors tend to be really good academically but not socially. Anyways, all right. The limbic system, the amygdaloid body, and the cingulate gyrus, those are the two that I pointed out. The amygdaloid body allows you to recognize angry or fearful facial expressions. It allows you to assess danger and elicits a fear response. So when you look at something and you get kind of scared, that's your amygdaloid body telling you, hey, this doesn't look right, or that person looks scared, or this is scary to me. The cingulate gyrus, your role in expressing your emotions via gestures. And it helps you resolve mental conflicts when you're going back and forth between the good and the bad. But your facial expressions. Some of you really need to have control over your facial expressions. I know I do, right? Because you can pretty much read what I want to tell you from my face. And sometimes I may not say a word, and I'm like, oh yeah. But you can tell I'm not buying it. Okay? And some of you are the exact same way. Some of you have straight poker faces, so you can't really tell either way, which is probably a good characteristic to have. I should probably, well, I've already tried to do that. I just can't. I can if I try. Never mind. Anyway, your limbic system also puts emotion to memories. Like, for example, smell. When you smell skunk, most people think that that's a bad smell. I have had only one student who has said, I love the smell of skunk. That's weird to me, but I was like, well, that's cool. Like, so you smell it and it makes you happy. I smell it and I'm thinking, don't breathe for the next mile because it's going to come through my air conditioning vents. Okay, that's me. As soon as I saw, oh, don't break. And my kids are talking, I'm like, okay, don't respond. Okay, so I think skunks smell bad. You know, I thought, like, certain things like my grandma's house, I didn't like the way I felt when I was there. So I have those memories of that. Some of you like going to your grandparents' house. That's all your limbic system. Okay, so it mentions that. It also mentions that the hippocampus here is responsible for playing a role in memory. So the more memory that you have, the more information that you retain, the larger your hippocampus. So that was the limbic system. Now we're at reticular activating. Reticular activating system here gives you the anatomy of it. I'm not so worried about the anatomy as I am the physiology, what it's responsible for. The reticular activating system is responsible for kind of keeping you alive. And this is your brain's little alerts that it sends to you that keeps you conscious and aware of your settings. I would venture to say that most of you are pretty tired. And when you're driving, I know that I am. When I'm driving, like I zone out. And that's not safe to say that, but that's what I do because I'm so exhausted. And then all of a sudden, it's like, I'm like, oh wait, like I'm driving. Like I missed my exit coming here today because I was just like, I just really want to take a nap. That's all I was thinking about is how I want to go to sleep. But then as soon as I got close to it, something just, and I was like, oh crap, I missed my exit, and so I had to go back around. Reticular activating is your brain sending signals that says, hey, you need to stay aware. You need to stay aware. I want to make sure you're still there. Hey, just doing a roll count real quick, making sure you're all here. Because you technically will just zone out. It is inhibited by alcohol. So if you are under the influence, whether it's alcohol or recreational or prescription drugs, this is inhibited. So it can keep you from sending that alert signal. But this also explains how when in the middle of the night, you'll be asleep and you'll wake up to roll over and you'll go right back to sleep. That was your reticular activating system. It was actually receiving sensory information. It said that blood flow somewhere in your body was low. So it sent you an impulse and said, hey, just reminding you, you're alive, and you'll roll over. Because the reason you want to roll over is because there's pain associated to wherever it was that you were lying down. And it's sending a message to your brain saying, we've been telling you. And I need you to wake up, roll over, and you'll go right back to sleep. So it's just sending those impulses to keep that going. Now that happens whether you're asleep or awake. Okay, but if, like I said, if you're under the influence of any type of drugs or alcohol, it pretty much, no. So it takes a lot to arouse somebody like that. If you're a deep sleeper, it could also be impaired. Some people are so exhausted that they'll stay in the same position the entire time they're asleep. And wake up the next morning in that exact same spot. So maybe some of you are at that point right now. But it doesn't mean that your brain is not sending signals to keep you alert. It mentions that the reticular activating system helps keep everything in line. It helps control coarse limb movements via the reticulospinal tracts. What am I talking about right now? The central nervous system, because it says tracts. This is it telling you, hey, basal motor, so we don't have a lot of oxygen here in this tissue, so I need you to go ahead and roll over. Or your cardiac center, it should be keeping your heart rate pretty low, but if it gets too low, we need to kind of speed that up. So it's just sending messages to help you maintain homeostasis. I like this diagram because it kind of just shows how it sends like an all-call signal to your cortex. Like, hey, just to get your attention, and then I'm back again. Okay? So when you're zoned out and then all of a sudden you come back, that's your reticular activating system. An EEG is an electroencephalogram, not to be confused with an ECG or EKG. EEG reads brain waves. So that's what we're about to look at. Here's a guy hooked up to an EEG. It shows you the different brain waves, and it's going to tell you here in a few slides what each of those means. But this is where your brain should be, where you're awake and relaxed. This is your awake and your alert. These waves right here in an adult should not be present, or they should, if they are present, they should be like very minute. This is more common in children who are taking in a lot of information and their brain waves are a little bit more irregular. And these are waves that you'll see in an individual who is sleeping or has experienced some type of brain damage. So delta waves are definitely not something that you want to have while you're awake. You should want something on those first two levels. Okay, so it tells you that the EEG measures your electrical activity in your brain, and you have those different types of waves. Here it defines each type of wave and tells you just what I told you a moment ago. Like, this is what you'll see in you but relaxed, and this is what you'll see in somebody who has brain damage, and so on. So here's that diagram a little bit closer. A lot bit closer. If you have a flat EEG, that pretty much means there's no electricity, so that patient is brain dead. Their heart could still be going, because we spoke on this the other day. Your heart has its own nervous system, so it beats on its own. Your brain doesn't have to tell your heart to beat. So your heart could still be going, you could still technically not breathe. You probably wouldn't be breathing as much on your own, although it is possible. If there's a flat line, you're brain dead. EEGs, what do we use them for? Pretty much to diagnose problems. We don't normally just do an EEG just for the heck of it, unless you're doing a sleep study or something like that. But still, you're trying to diagnose a problem if you're doing a sleep study. What is epilepsy? Epilepsy is where you lose control for a little bit over your control of your muscles. It allows that individual, they lose consciousness, they fall, and then they usually have these muscle jerkings that are uncontrollable. Epilepsy has absolutely nothing to do with your intelligence level, development. This is dealing with strictly the electrical activity in your brain. So when an individual is undergoing an epileptic seizure, there was an abnormality in the electricity, and after the seizure goes through, a lot of those patients, we'll talk about the two types of, a lot of those patients are fine afterwards, unless of course they were driving or something like that and there was an accident. A lot of individuals who have had epileptic seizures over and over again usually experience an aura before that they have an idea that something's about to happen. There are even dogs, service dogs, that can smell that seizure coming on and can indicate to somebody that whoever they're with is about to have a seizure. So we have service dogs that can do that now too. Two types of seizures: absent seizures versus tonic-clonic seizures. In my life as just a teacher, I have had students who have done both. An absent seizure, they're just kind of sitting there and all of a sudden they stare off and their eyes kind of jerk back and forth. And if you weren't paying attention, you would think that they were just daydreaming kind of thing, like they're just kind of like, and their eyes kind of jerk, and then they're back. And most people wouldn't recognize it. They are unresponsive during that time, so the only reason I knew was because I would try to talk to that student, and if they didn't respond, I knew that they were having a seizure. You don't do anything, you let them go through that seizure, you don't try to stop anything like that. And so those are absent seizures. The tonic-clonic are what we used to call the grand mal seizures, and most people still call them grand mal seizures. This is where that individual has an epileptic fit. So they usually fall, they get stiff, and their muscles start jerking. Again, you never try to stop that. If somebody's having a seizure, you just try to move everything out of their way so that they don't hurt themselves. A lot of times that patient is super embarrassed. Once it's done, sometimes they use the restroom on themselves. You want to put something under their head if you can so that they're not slamming their head on the ground. But they're usually like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Because it had nothing to do with whether or not, what that they could normally do. It was just the electrical activity in their brain. So, and after, as I mentioned, after it's over, it's over. Like, they can still do regular stuff. If they have a really bad seizure, then they're probably going to go to the hospital, and you'll have, make sure everything's okay. But they go back to regular life activities. We can control epilepsy with anticonvulsive drugs. You can be born and have epilepsy early on in life and outgrow it, and vice versa. Some people develop epilepsy as a result of something traumatic happening with an accident. So it can be either early or late in your life. We have anticonvulsive drugs. We also now have implants that they can put in the brain that can monitor the brain waves. And as those brain waves start to become more irregular, they actually shock it and kind of put it back into sync them again to prevent that seizure from occurring. Of course, you don't do that on somebody who's had one seizure. This is somebody who's had multiple seizures, and it's an issue, some type of chronic condition. This slide right here talks about consciousness, and then it talks about sensation versus perception, which you and I addressed at the very beginning. But consciousness is just being awake and alert. Okay, loss of consciousness, if it's just brief, we call that fainting or syncope. If it's a long-term loss of consciousness, you're in a coma. Like, you're just not conscious. Okay? And it talks about how consciousness is on a continuum. Like, just because I'm conscious doesn't mean I'm alert and learning. Some of us are just barely awake. And some of us are really high-strung and high activity levels. So there's a continuum of what you would consider conscious. Okay? But they still need to be able to respond in some way. Sleep and wake cycles. So this goes through REM and non-REM sleep. Non-REM is non-rapid eye movement. REM is rapid eye movement. There are 4 stages of sleep that you and I are going to discuss briefly. They go 1 to 4. And through the night, you start from 1, 2, 3, 4, then you go back up, then you go back down, then you go back up. Those are what we call those sleep cycles, and going in between those sleep stages. The deeper in the sleep that you are, the 3 and 4 is non-rapid eye movement, and the rapid eye movement is, I just said that backwards. The rapid eye movement is the deep sleep, and the non-rapid eye movement is the early sleep, the 1s and 2s. So the deeper you are in a sleep, the more likely you are to start dreaming, and those are going to be, that's when you're dreaming and your eyes are moving a lot. Whenever you're a rapid eye movement and you're deep sleep, we tend to see your heart rate kind of jump up a lot if you're dreaming. And sometimes it's supposedly said, and I'm not a sleep expert, that you dream all the time. You just don't remember those dreams. But those of you who do dream and have pretty vivid dreams, sometimes you'll wake up scared, or you'll wake up sweating, or you'll wake up crying because it's elicited an emotional response. So your heart rate, your breathing rate, and all of that has been manipulated by an emotional response to whatever's going on in that sleep cycle. The deeper you get into sleep, you're supposed to be paralyzed, like a sleep paralysis, but sometimes we have people who walk around. It's scary sometimes, right? So it shows you, here's you awake. I did say that right. I confused my own self. So rapid eye movement, non-rapid eye movement. And I apologize. I think I'm just ready to go to sleep. But whenever you're in the rapid eye movement sleep, that's when their eyes jump back and forth. And yes, you do dream in your light sleep, which is why you're easily aroused. And I don't know why I can't get my life straight right now. Whenever we talk about moms and people who don't sleep a lot, like was probably going on with you right now, myself as well, you don't get to the deep sleep. This is supposed to be your restorative sleep, so your brain never really rests. So you stay pretty active. In fact, some of you probably go to sleep thinking about all the stuff you need to get done the next time you wake up. Okay? When you talk about new moms, science shows that after a woman has a baby, she won't sleep again well for 6 years. They have linked postpartum depression and all of that to her sleep skills. 6 years after you have a child, will you start to sleep regularly again? Okay? Because you get to stage 1, and then a kid's right next to your bed. And if you have a newborn, you start to fall asleep and somebody cries. So you go get them. And so you're constantly up. And I'm not saying that dads don't help, because some dads are really active. But we see this pattern in women a whole lot more than men. When they're like, oh my gosh, she's crazy. Yes, she is crazy. Because she hasn't slept. She might be asleep, but she's not asleep. Okay? And she cycles through. So we're about to look at, let me show you, this alternating pattern. So this is what you should do in a healthy night. You should oscillate back and forth. And as you get closer to your wake-up time, this is when you tend to dream more, because you don't get into your deepest sleep. Okay? Sometimes, if you're waking up in the middle of the night, you have a scary dream in the middle of the night, and you're like, ooh, I'm going to remember that dream, because it was so crazy. But then you go back to sleep and you forget it. The next morning, you're trying to remember it. Once you get into that deep sleep, things just start to wash away again. When we have moms, she goes here, baby cries, oh, here, uh-oh, and over, and she never ever gets down here. And that, like I said, 6 years. We have multiple studies that reinforce that. So if you have a small kid, and 6 years. So now you know. Let me go back and make sure I said everything I need to say. Yes, your reticular activating system is what mediates your sleep stages. So it's the one that tells you, hey, it's time to wake up real quick, roll over, and make sure that everything's good and go back to sleep. So it regulates those sleep stages. Here's where it talks about that the non-REM sleep is important for restoring your brain. REM sleep, people who are deprived of that sleep become more depressed and moody. Your sleep stages at 4, you tend to sleep less the older you are. So you tend to wake up earlier the older you are after sleep. But that also is associated with retirement, and there's nothing else for you to do. So you wake up and then you realize you have nothing to do. And there's a lot of studies that back that up as well. Narcolepsy. Narcolepsy is where you randomly fall asleep. I've only had one narcoleptic student. And the way that you treat that, there are chemicals that cause you to wake up. We call them orexins. And if you're narcoleptic, those chemicals are being broken down. So you don't have any wake-up chemicals. So what's telling you to stay awake isn't there, so you just fall asleep. And he would be talking, and then all of a sudden he's like, Brian, you good? And he would be asleep for like 3 or 4 minutes, and then he would sit up, and he would kind of look around. But he always sat in the back because he knew that it was going to happen, and it kept him from being embarrassed. It was crazy. At that point, I was like, wow, this is a real thing. Like, he's really trying, and he just cannot stay awake. Insomnia is the exact opposite. You can't go to sleep, and we think that that's an overactive wake-up chemicals, overactive orexins. So we try to give you medicines that will help kind of slow that down so you can go to sleep. The problem with that is a lot of medications, one of their side effects is insomnia. So you're taking... Yeah, read side effects sometimes. What's sleep apnea? Where you stop breathing during your sleep, and it's called temporary hypoxia, which means a lower level of oxygen. Sleep apnea, there's some type of obstruction, whether it's nasal, your tongue, something that's causing you to stop breathing. Most of the time, people with sleep apnea don't sleep well, and neither do the people that are around them, because this person usually snores a lot, and it's a loud snore. So if they're snoring, they're not getting good amounts of oxygen, and the people around them can't sleep because it's so loud and disruptive. So it's just an unhappy household overall. Okay. Language, I told you, is a combination already of the Broca's and Wernicke's area. Wernicke's is what you're going to say. Broca's is how you're physically going to say it. Memory, you have short-term memory and long-term memory. Short-term memory becomes long-term memory when you repeat it over and over again. And I already told you there was that rule of 3s. But you only have so much short-term memory. So this class is really great for short-term, like, hey, I'm trying to get this knocked out of the way. But to remember this stuff, you have to study it a lot because you're going to have to apply it in other courses. So it's exposure to that. So there's benefits to it. But because of the way this class works, you memorize it, then you purge it because you have to memorize more material. And so you lose that long-term memory consolidation. So the goal is to sleep so that you can increase that long-term memory. And again, the more information you have, the more folds in your brain. So that's why it says that capacity is limitless. It tells you what kind of things will help you create long-term memories. If you can tie sense to anything, visual, auditory, taste, touch, or smell to anything, you'll better remember it. If you're just reading it, the less likely you are to remember it. Okay, so you have to tie some type of emotion or sense to that. Factors that affect the transfer from short-term memory to long-term memory: emotional state. If I can tie emotion to it, I'm going to remember it. If I can repeat it, if I can associate it with something I already know, which is why I try to create those associations. And then sometimes you just remember things immediately in long-term memory. Like there's certain things that happen to you, usually traumatic, that you can immediately recall. They may have happened one time and you never heard about it again, but if I put you back in a situation where you hear a sound or see a person, you can immediately recall that in memory, and you didn't rehearse it or go through it twice. So that would just be automatic memory. Declarative memory is the memory of just facts. Some of you are really good memorizers, and like the practical is going to be really a good thing for you, because you're really good at just recall, and then be done. There's declarative memory, and then there's non-declarative memory. Non-declarative memory is something where you're applying it. I'm doing something procedural, acting it out. So either declarative or non-declarative memories. Brain structures involved with memories: hippocampus. I've already said that. That's redundant. Here we go. I'm showing you the hippocampus here. It's missing the rest of that was there, but hippocampus. Okay? Brain structures involved in memory. So I already mentioned the hippocampus, and then we have the amygdala body. For motor memory, it's the cerebellum. Where's the cerebellum? Back here. Cerebrum, cerebellum. Okay? So there we go there. Protection of the brain, the meninges, which can, an inflammation of the meninges is meningitis. So you have 3 layers that protect your brain from all types of things, and they create your blood-brain barrier. The meninges contain cerebral spinal fluid. They will have partitions that form onto the skull. You'll kind of see if you are removing or doing a autopsy, the Dura Mater is actually attached, so you have to like kind of separate that if you're ever in one of those autopsies. The 3 layers. This right here is the layer that's on the brain. So it goes pia mater, arachnoid mater, Dura Mater. So Dura Mater is the most superficial. Again, an inflammation of the meninges is called meningitis. So itis of anything is an inflammation of it. So meningitis is an inflammation of the meninges. There's viral and bacterial meningitis. Here is a quick cross-section so you can see the layers, but pia mater is right here. It's on the surface of the brain. So here we have a layer. It's kind of like a layer of saran wrap. Then we have where all the blood vessels are. Here's my arachnoid mater. And then we have our Dura Mater. Dura Mater literally means tough mother, so it's really, really thick. You can't tear it. Like, you have to cut it. Like, it won't tear under you tearing it. Super thick and very tough. Very tough. Here is talking about just the fact that the Dura Mater being the strongest one. You don't have to know the specific anatomical structures associated. But here's the Dura Mater, and you can see that it goes up against the skull there. It's actually attached there to the skull, and it protects the brain. Here is part of the brain without the Dura Mater. Here's the part with the Dura Mater. Dura Mater looks like, all of it together looks like a swim cap. I don't know how many of you are familiar with swim caps, like super tight. That's what that looks like. And if you've ever got to hold it, that's kind of what it feels like. It's not as elastic, but that's what it feels like. So it goes Dura Mater, if we're going from superficial in, Dura Mater, then arachnoid mater, then pia mater. So when we're labeling things, we have Dura Mater here. This is epidural space because epi means on top of. Underneath that is called subdural. And then we have arachnoid mater. And then this would be subarachnoid. I'm going to spell that wrong. Sorry. I'm not going to keep. And then you have pia mater. So you have epidural, Dura Mater, and then subdural, arachnoid mater, subarachnoid, and then pia mater. When you have an epidural, it's administered outside of the Dura Mater. So it's epidural. If you have a lumbar tap, it goes into the subarachnoid space. Either way, you're dealing with the covering of your central nervous system, so it's extremely delicate, and there's a high risk of injury there. So it mentions that. The cerebral spinal fluid is contained in the subarachnoid space. So right here is where that cerebral spinal fluid is. This is also where the blood vessels are, and that makes sense because the blood vessels will bring the oxygen and nutrients and drop it off into the cerebral spinal fluid, and then it will diffuse across the pia mater to the brain. So it will feed the brain there. Subdural. So here that is again. You have your Dura Mater collectively, then the subdural space, epidural, then you have your arachnoid mater, subarachnoid, and then pia mater right there on it. Again, you can see the blood vessels here, cerebral spinal fluid there. Delicate, the pia mater, it's right on the brain. What is the cerebral spinal fluid? So here it has it as one word. And I told you whenever I first saw CSF, I said it will either be cerebral spinal fluid, like 3 words, or it will be cerebrospinal. Here it says cerebrospinal. Okay, so it's the same thing. I'm just telling you it shows up in different ways. Cerebral spinal fluid, what is it? It can have a lot of different components. So what my CSF has is going to be different from yours, especially based on your diet. But it should have electrolytes, water, vitamins. It should have some oxygen. It should have a lot of different components. Okay, plasma. so on. What's the purpose of it? It allows for buoyancy of your brain. Okay, so your brain's kind of like floating there. It also cushions, like as you move your head back and forth. If your brain hits your skull, it's going to bruise. And we're going to talk about that in a moment. So that cerebral spinal fluid tries to cushion that movement back and forth. Okay, here is an excellent diagram. Shows you all the cerebral spinal fluid. Then it shows you these choroid plexi, or plexus. Choroid plexus is what makes the cerebral spinal fluid. So I already mentioned that you're constantly making cerebral spinal fluid. These are the structures that make it. And then it's cycled out through your lymphatic system, and you will pee it out eventually. The choroid plexus, I told you this is what makes it. Normal volume of around 150 milliliters replaced every 8 hours. So whenever you have to take medicine twice a day or whatever, it's because whatever its impact is, it's going to get washed out or filtered out. Here shows you, here would be the cerebral spinal fluid. Here's your ependymal cells. Here's your blood vessel. So your blood vessel brings it, it diffuses across that, and it gets into the cerebral spinal fluid, which can serve the brain. Hydrocephalus means that you have extra fluid on your brain. This becomes an issue for adults. It can cause us to crush our brains, but if we see this in an infant, because their skull has not solidified yet, it'll stretch out because of those fontanelles that we discussed in the skeletal chapter. What we're doing here to treat that is draining that fluid. So the brain is right here, and so they're just draining that fluid. Hopefully there's not any long-term damage. Hydrocephalus for an adult would cause brain damage and probably death. If we know that there's swelling on your brain, we will, if we can get you to the hospital in time, we will cut out part of your skull, and we'll sew it into your abdomen, because we used to keep it in the freezer, but people got their skulls pieces mixed up. So now we sew it in your abdomen to keep that tissue alive and in your blood and not rejected or anything like that. But if we can cut out part of your skull temporarily, it allows your brain to kind of swell and then kind of come back in. So, but that's if we can get you to the hospital. If it happens and you can't get medical help, it will crush because your skull's not moving. What's the blood-brain barrier supposed to do? Get blood off the brain and help maintain homeostasis. The ependymal cells and the astrocytes, well, the astrocytes help get the nerves there. The ependymal cells will actually create the blood-brain barrier. Here is showing you the feet of the astrocytes that surrounded these blood vessels, and I had mentioned that earlier, keeping these vessels off of that nervous tissue. Astrocytes, central nervous system, or peripheral? Central. This whole chapter is central, just so you know. All 11 is peripheral, all 12 is central. Okay, what's the function of a blood-brain barrier? Well, the brain, okay, thank you. Good deal. Brain injuries. Concussion is temporary. Contusion is permanent. Subdural or subarachnoid hemorrhage. So you already know where those areas are, okay, and depending on where they are in your body, the pressure is going to cause some type of damage. We will, of course, want to get there and reduce any swelling. Definitely not treated could result in death. Cerebral edema. What is that? Swelling of the brain. So again, we just go in, cut out part, and we usually take your temporal bone, part of your temporal bone. Cardiovascular accidents, or CVAs. And normally in a clinical setting, it'll be like, oh, we have a patient with a CVA. That could include a lot of different things. Ischemia, or ischemia, however you want to say it, is just temporary loss of oxygen to that tissue. Hopefully it's temporary. If we don't get oxygen to that tissue, so if it's temporary, we call it transient. If it's we never get oxygen back to that tissue again, what happens to the tissue if we don't get oxygen to it? It dies. That tissue dies. Now, if it's in your brain, there's no oxygen, that tissue dies. Yeah, okay. So we have an expiration of our patient. And what causes those? Blood clots. You have these traveling I cannot think about it right now. No, that's what stops it. I don't know. I'm talking about the thrombo is the platelets, but you have blood clots floating around and they get stuck, and it's either cerebral or pulmonary ischemic attacks. What is it called? Thrombosis. Yes. Yeah, these are all things. I'm trying to think of what we call it by itself. A thrombus, that was that floating blood clot, so that's what that is. I'm just trying to put more to it. Anyways, it's where you have a bunch of platelets, but those are all examples of the things that could cause ischemia. Hemiplegia is where you lose that to one side. So it's not the whole side, it's just one half. Depending on which side it is, you might lose speech or the ability to think about what you're going to say versus what you're going to say, so we talked about that. What can we do to stop this or treat it is TPA, which is tissue plasminogen activator. This is basically a blood thinner. Problem with blood thinners is if you get hurt, you can't clot. But you don't clot, so you have a high-risk patient right there. Alzheimer's is where you have proteins build up on your brain and they eat holes in your brain. Your brain shrinks. You can't technically diagnose Alzheimer's until after the patient has expired. We can diagnose based on symptoms. MRIs don't even show the plaque buildup yet. So we don't truly know that they have Alzheimer's until after they've passed, although we can treat them based on the way that they're acting, their symptoms, and so on. Parkinson's disease, these are all neural diseases, which is why they're talked about here. So the nervous tissue is damaged and you lose that voluntary control, so you kind of shake. There have been quite a few medicinal use of marijuana here to calm those nerves, and it stops the shaking. There's other drugs that do that, dopamine releasers and so on. So you're having tremors even when you're supposed to be just relaxing. Huntington's disease is one of my favorite diseases to talk about, but we're not going to talk about it because it's really getting late. But this is a reverse disease, so you grow up nice, healthy, but it's autosomal dominant, which means once you have it, you pass it on to your kids. And the crazy thing is you don't even manifest symptoms until you're in your late 30s, early 40s, so you've already had kids. And there's quite a few cases in Texas, and there's one specific murder trial where a woman her husband passed away, and then she ended up killing both of her sons because her husband had Huntington's disease, and then her sons both developed it. And they said, if we're going to end up like Dad, we want you to kill us. She shot him, she got arrested, but then she was let off because they said that it was a traumatic situation because she lost her husband and two sons all within a short time period. Once Huntington's disease becomes active, it takes about 2 to 3 years for that decline. You're this nice, healthy, strapping 35, 38-year-old man, and then you go to being bedridden and can't control anything in about 2 to 3 years. And it's one of those things where you've already had kids. If you knew you had it, you probably wouldn't have kids. But when we talk about the spinal cord, so everything we've talked about so far has gone from the brain. Now we're at the spinal cord. The location, it should come all the way down to about the middle of your lumbar area. So it mentions L1, L2. What's the function of the spinal cord? To provide information from your nerves to your brain. The epidural space is where the outside of the Dura Mater. The CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, is in the subarachnoid space. That doesn't change. If you have a lumbar puncture or tap, you're getting into that subarachnoid space. This is showing that happening. So I went through the Dura Mater, through the arachnoid mater, and now I'm in the subarachnoid space. You have a large needle that does that. That's not a small needle doing that. And you need that patient to be really still. Of course, this is not a comfortable procedure, and you sign a ton of waivers. Even if you have an epidural, you're going in to have a baby or surgery on your lower limbs, you still have to sign a lot of waivers because you're talking about a small distance. If he hits that nerve, you're going to have damage. So it says if you can taste blood, you may have headaches after this for the rest of your life. So on, make sure you read all that paperwork. It's like this much.
I didn't even feel that when you did that to me.
Yeah, well, good. That's the whole point of it, I think, is that you don't feel it. Here's your spinal cord going down, and then I mentioned in a previous lecture that it kind of frays. This is what we call the cauda equina, which means horse's tail. So you have the main part of your spinal cord ending here, and then the cauda equina, which is a bunch of nerves fraying there at the end. Here you have it on a cadaver. It really looks cool in real life. I know we're kind of flipping through it. You have 31 pair of spinal nerves, 12 pair of cranial nerves. I already talked about the cauda equina. Ventral is dealing with what? I know, but sensory or motor? Motor. Dorsal is dealing with sensory, so you're going to see that. Here is my spinal cord here. I'm going to have sensory, motor here, sensory here. This nerve is going to be sensory because it's going to the back. Sensory. This nerve is going to go motor because it's in the front. So it's going to go sensory here, integrate it, motor, out. Sensory here, integrate it, motor, out. It's going to be that pattern constant. We're going to see that over and over again when we do our last lecture. So when we say ganglia, just a bulge, it's a bunch of cell bodies together. So this is technically called dorsal root ganglia. So it's on the dorsal side, and it's the ganglia. And that's going to be sensory. Dorsal, so if it says dorsal, it's sensory. If it says ventral, it's motor. Okay, so I'm going to let you go through that there. White matter, you already know that white matter is myelinated. Ascending is sending sensory information. Descending is motor information. Yes. Here we have the same patterns again, red and blue. Here it talks about the tracts. Tracts are found in the central nervous system. Let's just look at it just for a real quick. Spinocerebellar tract. Tell me where this tract is located. Spinal cord to the cerebellum. Do you see why they're named like that? Like it's telling you where that information is traveling to. Okay? Spinothalamic tract. Spinal cord to the thalamus. Yes. Okay? So it goes through a few of those. Paralysis is where you lose motor function. Every time anything is going to be paralysis, it's going to be something on the ventral side. So you're going to see damage ventral, ventral, ventral. So if it's flaccid paralysis, ventral horn. So we're at the front. That's motor. So you can no longer control your muscles. They begin to atrophy. Spastic paralysis, where is it talk about the damage? Damage to the upper motor neurons of the primary motor cortex. This didn't happen to the spinal cord itself, but where did this happen? Upper motor, or primary motor cortex. Where's the primary motor cortex? It's up here. Okay, it's in the brain, so that's not the spinal cord itself. So something happened here, you got hit in the head or something like that, and that created that problem. A transection, that means this is talking specifically about your spinal cord. If you're a paraplegic, that means only 2 of your limbs are paralyzed. It usually happens between the thoracic and the lumbar area, in this area. If you're a quadriplegic, it's in your cervical area that damage occurred. Spinal shock. This is where you kind of lose control, but it's just temporary, usually. It's because you had some type of lesion, and it says caudal lesion. So wherever you lose control, wherever that lesion was, you lost control from underneath it. So if the lesion was like here, you would lose control from down under that. So it says caudal to the lesion. So underneath where that lesion is. Okay? Polio, destruction of ventral horn motor neurons. What are polio patients suffering from? Ventral horn motor neurons. Is it sensory or motor? Motor. Like the ventral, they can't move. Like their muscles, they usually, a lot of them now have, well, if we still have people who have polio, they're using those different crutches. Most of the people who had that when they were younger, a lot of them expired. That sounded mean. ALS is Lou Gehrig's disease. Destruction of the ventral horn motor neurons. Same thing. Okay, well, I mean, not the exact same thing, but caused by a different cause. You slowly lose the ability to speak, swallow, and breathe. So this isn't specifically a virus that's doing this to you. It could, but it's mentioning here that it's an environmental factor and sometimes genetic mutations that lead to this. So you could develop this later on in life. Central nervous system, how do we assess any damage? We do reflex tests, we run MRIs, CAT scans, PETs, all of that stuff. Ectoderm, when you're developing, this is the same as it was in Chapter 11. Your nervous system develops from your outer layer of nervous tissue, which is called your ectoderm. And if you're a boy, your brain develops a certain way. If you're a girl, your brain develops a different way. So a boy's brain and a girl's brain are not exactly the same. If a mom smokes while she's pregnant, it does lead to lack of oxygen in utero, which decreases brain development. Babies are usually born premature. It talks about the hypothalamus as one of the last areas to develop. Visual cortex develops slowly over the first 11 weeks. you can't really see when you're born. You have to develop that over time. So that's why whenever people are first talking to babies, they're all in their face to get them to respond, because the baby can't see far away. And that's a real thing. We technically see with age things get worse, but if you take care of yourself and continue to work your brain, you should be able to control and keep your decelerating to a minimum. Shrinkage of the brain accelerates in old age. Don't drink alcohol or box.